is Paul Vallone. You're listening to 106.7 Wilmington's Big Talker. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom from London. Yes, London, England, where I am recording this. After all, what could be more fitting? In the UK, we see the model Joe Biden and company have in mind for us. A police state posing as a free country where its subjects are under electronic surveillance at all times, particularly from the tens of thousands of closed-circuit television cameras, where blanket surveillance is so pervasive that Amnesty International has made it a campaign to stop it. The UK government keeps records of every website every citizen visits for up to a year, with this information also including the apps they use on their phone and the metadata for their calls. In a country where police have few restrictions on their ability to detain you, and of course where you have not only no right to own a firearm, but no right to defend yourself. That is what Joe Biden's America will look like if we let it. In a moment, we will discuss Biden's press conference, the gun control he called for, and more importantly, what he really wants. Before the bad news, however, let me offer you some good news at a state level. Many of you know about the problems we've been having during the pandemic with delays in obtaining North Carolina pistol purchase permits. Under North Carolina law, to buy either a handgun in either a dealer transaction or a private transfer, you must first have either a North Carolina pistol purchase permit or a North Carolina concealed handgun permit. The purchase permit statute is a leftover Jim Crow law. It was passed in 1919, patterned after Missouri's law, which passed in 1918, which was itself a response to race riots in St. Louis. Under this relic of Jim Crow, a sheriff can decide that the applicant is not of good moral character, whatever that means, and for entirely subjective reasons deny the permit. And needless to say, historically, many of the applicants denied have been black. In fact, a recent article in North Carolina Law Review, published by the UNC School of Law, they find that permit issuance is still racially biased. Indeed, looking at permit issuance in Wake County between 2015 and 2020, the sheriff rejected fully 23.5% of black applicants, but only 8.3% of white applicants, a rejection rate for blacks of 3 times that of whites. Nor is that the only problem with the law. In March of last year, anti-gun Wake County Sheriff Gerald Baker decided to stop issuing permits altogether, claiming he was stopping due to the pandemic. I guess when you scream COVID-19, the world comes to a halt, as we have seen. But because you can't legally buy a handgun in North Carolina without either a purchase permit or a concealed handgun permit, Baker effectively shut down Wake County residents' ability to exercise their Second Amendment rights during a pandemic and rioting, exactly when they most needed those rights. Now, together with 2 other organizations, we sued Baker, and he has at least started issuing permits. But even then, he dragged his feet. Despite a statute stipulating that permits must be issued within 14 days, Baker was literally taking months to issue the permits. So we sued him again. At this point, Baker is now issuing purchase permits within the stipulated 14-day time period, although at this point he is now dragging his feet on issuing concealed handgun permits. But in other counties, most notably Mecklenburg and Guilford, delays are still the norm. Now, my organization has been trying to repeal the purchase permit law for almost 20 years. We've gotten the repeal through the North Carolina Senate in 2013 as part of Omnibus Gun Bill H-937, but when then-Governor Pat McCrory threatened to veto the legislation that contained it, if it contained it, it was stripped from the bill. The problem has been the powerful North Carolina Sheriff's Association. You see, the sheriffs wanted to keep the power to decide who can and cannot legally buy a handgun. Now, they've come up with various ridiculous reasons for keeping the law. One of them I call the tinfoil hat theory, that kind of goes like this, and various sheriffs have told me variations of this, but Jimmy Joe Bob wears a tinfoil hat to keep out the alien rays from his brain, and now he wants to buy a pistol, so I know he's not a good applicant, so I denied him a permit. Now, this becomes even more ridiculous when you consider that in urban counties, the sheriff rarely meets applicants, much less does he know their idiosyncrasies. Then we have the equally ridiculous notion that a sheriff might issue a purchase permit if the federal government were to disable the computerized National Instant Background Check System. This, they say, is supposed to be a favor to gun owners because we'll issue permits if Joe Biden shuts down NICS. Well, that argument neatly avoids mentioning that the sheriff can't legally issue a purchase permit without a NICS check. Most amusing, if such can be said, is the fact that somebody could get a permit, get a pistol purchase permit from a sheriff, which is good for 5 years, then go out and commit a crime, do a couple of years in prison, and get out in time to use the permit, neatly bypassing NICS. And, of course, we have the Democrats who, while screaming about erasing racism, continue to support this racist law. But now we have a breakthrough. The president of the North Carolina Sheriff's Association, Sheriff David Mahoney of Transylvania County, brought the issue to the attention of the association. And after a vote, the sheriffs now support repeal of the pistol purchase permit law. This is groundbreaking. Happily, legislation has been introduced to repeal the racist and unconstitutional pistol purchase permit law. In the North Carolina Senate, Senators Dan Britt, Jim Perry, and Todd Johnson have introduced S. 687 for a full repeal of the statute. Equally, in the House, Representatives Keith Kidwell, Bobby Hannick, Ed Goodwin, and Ben Moss have introduced H. 559. But interestingly, the first bill to get a hearing, giving it the potential to address a full repeal before the others, will be Representative Jay Adams' bill, H. 398, which comes before the full House Judiciary 4 Committee next week. Although the bill is not currently a full repeal of the pistol purchase permit system, language for the repeal could be substituted in the committee hearing. Now, GRNC will have alerts out on the bill by Monday, so I strongly suggest you subscribe to our alerts by going to grnc.org and clicking on the link on the right side of the page. That way you can find out which legislators to contact to help move the bill. But the repeal of the Jim Crow-era pistol purchase permit system is by no means assured. Anti-gun Governor Roy Cooper will almost certainly veto the repeal. And Republicans don't have a large enough majority in either chamber to override his veto. That means we'll need some Democrats. Now, you might consider that unlikely in the current polarized political environment. Democrats don't support much of anything except gun bans. But they might find it difficult to continue supporting racist gun control, particularly now that the sheriffs support a full repeal. Stand by for future developments. Right now, you're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. We have to take a short break, after which we will discuss what gun control Joe Biden really wants, and it isn't just the measures he announced last week. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today at Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. So now the attack on the Second Amendment we've all been expecting, even dreading, is underway. Last week, Joe Biden held an elaborate press conference to announce his long-awaited gun control, or at least part of it. He's calling on Congress to ban all sorts of other things, of course, but for now, King Joe is content to issue executive orders to get the show started. And get it started he most certainly did. It was quite a production. First was Kamala Harris telling us how Biden's edicts are just, and I quote, gun safety laws, that the solutions exist to our epidemic of gun violence, and that, of course, we must close that dreaded gun show loophole. But the real, I believe the phrase he used was one-horse pony. The real one-horse pony is Biden himself, who, incidentally, could not remember the name of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which he repeatedly called the AFT. Mostly, Biden told the same gun control lies we've heard for decades, but which you might not have heard for years, if ever, as well as one brand new claim for gun control. In his audience, of course, he paraded the victims of what he calls gun violence, more on that in a moment, because in the tradition of leftists everywhere, he can't let a good tragedy go to waste. And Biden pontificated on how he has tasked his new anti-gun attorney general, Merrick Garland, with, quote, prioritizing gun violence, saying that gun-related homicide is a public health crisis, and insisting that among his proposals, and I quote, nothing infringes on the Second Amendment. Yeah, right. So let's take a look at Biden's claims in order that you can explain to friends and family how their commander-in-chief is actually the liar-in-chief. First, there were the old gun control fallacies, including that favorite, quote, no right is absolute, says Joe. After all, he insists, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You hear this misrepresentation all the time. Back in the 1990s, at a gun forum, an anti-gun congressional candidate came up to me and said, and I quote, you people, nothing good ever starts with you people. You people, he said, think that your gun rights are absolute, but all rights have limits. After all, I can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So I had to explain to this lawyer that prosecuting somebody for misusing their rights by yelling fire is a very different thing from imposing prior restraint on the rights of the law-abiding. That's what gun control represents, a prior restraint. In fact, if we applied the prior restraint of gun control to free speech, I would be bound and gagged before entering the theater on the premise that I might yell fire. When I said that, he skittered away like a cockroach. So, says our would-be dictator, gun violence in this country is an epidemic. First of all, whenever you hear it, I want you to reject the phrase gun violence. Tell them the phrase is a fabrication of the left to imply that somehow death by gun is worse than death by knife or baseball bat or improvised explosive device. If they were really concerned with saving lives, rather than just restricting our freedom, they would look at ways to reduce all violence. Next, let's take a look at this epidemic, shall we? The first thing you should understand is that with the exception of a few years during the last time a Democrat held the Oval Office, violent crime in the U.S. has in recent decades plummeted. Indeed, according to Bureau of Justice statistics, violent crime dropped by 74% from 1993 to 2019. So Joe's epidemic doesn't exist with one notable exception: the past year. In 2020, the FBI finds a 25% increase in homicide, a 10.5% increase in aggravated assault, and a 3.3% increase in overall violent crime. And those nationwide figures are almost certainly driven by exponential increases in urban violence in just a few areas. For example, with homicides up in Chicago by 50%. In New York, homicides up 60% and rape up by 54%. Or how about Oakland, California, with a whopping 314% increase in homicide, and of course that Antifa favorite, Portland, Oregon, with a 300% increase in homicide. Now, what do these and other cities have in common? Why, leftists, of course, as in leftists in positions of power. Leftists who have defunded police in at least 20 cities, causing law enforcement professionals to quit in droves. Leftists who enacted what they have called bail reform, which is in reality nothing more than letting criminals loose immediately upon arrest. And leftists who, citing COVID-19, are releasing criminals from prison in droves. Whatever epidemic we have, the left has created. And now, citing the epidemic they created, they say that you, the law-abiding citizen, must give up your guns. That's right. They manufacture the problem, then they blame you. Maybe you recall the last time this happened, when during the Obama administration, Attorney General Eric Holder claimed we had to ban so-called assault weapons because they were being smuggled into Mexico and used by cartels. At precisely the same moment, in Operation Fast and Furious, Eric Holder's Justice Department was smuggling them into Mexico for use by cartels. In fact, it only came to light when Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was murdered with one of those guns. This stuff is straight out of Saul Alinsky's playbook, Rules for Radicals, folks. None of this is an accident. To create the great socialist utopia they want, they must first destroy the existing society. And no, this doesn't make me a grand conspiracy theorist. All right, as one of my early board members put it, you don't have to be a member of the choir to sing from the same piece of sheet music. Among the steps Biden is taking immediately are tasking his anti-gun Attorney General, Merrick Garland, with a series of actions to be enacted in 30 to 60 days, including banning what gun control advocates call ghost guns. You and I call them 80% lowers. At present, if you fabricate a firearm yourself, it has not passed in interstate commerce, and as such, it is not subject to regulation under the much-tortured Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which is invoked by Congress in regulating guns. The key is that you must make it by yourself without help from others, and you must not sell it or otherwise transfer the gun, which, by the way, is a contradiction of Garland's claim. At the conference, he claimed that guns are being, quote, sold without serial numbers and background checks. Got to tell you, folks, that's a crime. It's a crime now. As such, the gun is not serial numbered if the hobbyist makes it and doesn't sell it, and can't be tracked and potentially confiscated by a government that has no federal Form 4473. That's the form that numerous sources allege is being used by the BATFE to illegally register guns in violation of the Brady Act. Of course, the kits Biden intends to ban aren't guns, they can't fire, and they require considerable machining to finish. Essentially, Biden is talking about regulating a piece of plastic or steel as though it were a gun. But, you say, I don't build my own guns. Why should I care? Well, consider Biden's statement that he wants to require what he calls key parts to have serial numbers. Here we have the real agenda. What we're seeing is an attempt not to regulate just guns, but parts of guns, such that in Biden's scheme, things like aftermarket triggers and barrels and bolt carriers or other parts would each require a background check and transfer through a licensed dealer, neatly shutting down gunsmith customizing of firearms. Add to this, of course, the profusion of 3D printers and 3D printed guns, which cannot be effectively regulated, suggesting that, as always, the only people being restricted are lawful gun owners, while criminals continue to flout the law. Next on the Biden agenda was tasking the BATF with a brand new report on firearms trafficking in America, which we will discuss after a short break. Right now, you're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. When we return, we'll talk about what Joe Biden really wants and how to stop it. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Before our break, we were discussing the Biden gun ban agenda. Next on that agenda is tasking the BATF with a brand new report on firearms trafficking in America. This, Biden assures us, will be used to stop gun trafficking. Gun trafficking, as an excuse, dates back to about 17 or 18 years ago when gun control organizations started talking about an iron pipeline of guns being smuggled from places where people are relatively free to own guns, like North Carolina, to leftist bastions like New York, where people may not. The question gun control advocates can never seem to answer is why the guns, supposedly smuggled to New York and elsewhere, cause such problems there, but not in the states from which they are supposedly smuggled. In truth, this claim is akin to somebody saying they are a stakeholder. I love that word. A stakeholder in, for example, the land of a rancher who wants to divert a river to water his cattle. Here the environmentalist claims he or she is a stakeholder because some species of snail darter would supposedly be threatened by the rancher's action. You see, invoking the word stakeholder allows them to control other people's property. Similarly, gun trafficking and iron pipeline are cute bits of artifice that allow those in blighted areas like Chicago to control people here in North Carolina by claiming that it is our policies that are the problem rather than theirs. We actually killed a proposal for a gun trafficking study commission right here in North Carolina, presented by the statists at North Carolinians Against Gun Violence, formerly North Carolinians for Gun Control, a number of years back. We branded it the Gun Owner Harassment Commission, and I expect exactly the same from Biden. The next time you hear somebody lamenting gun trafficking as though it were drug trafficking, ask them why those horrible guns only seem to cause problems in the blighted urban areas to which they are supposedly trafficked, not the relatively free areas they are trafficked from. Next, Uncle Joe Biden, that makes me think of Uncle Joe Stalin, claimed that we must regulate pistols that have stabilizing braces because it makes these guns more accurate. That was his word, accurate. So now it appears that in the theory of Goldilocks gun control, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, some guns are too big, some guns are too small, but they never seem to say which gun is just right. So now apparently guns can be too accurate because, according to Uncle Joe, it makes them too lethal. And as part of his Dog and Pony Show, Merrick Garland, in his presentation, added that they make guns more stable and accurate because, heaven forbid, you should want your pistol to be stable and accurate. Anyway, now Joe's controllers want to regulate these too accurate pistols as what are called Title II weapons, like machine guns, under the 1934 National Firearms Act, which, contrary to what Joe claimed, involves a lot more than just paying a tax. In truth, it involves a lengthy and difficult process in which you must submit fingerprints, photos, and a lengthy application along with your $200 for each gun. The ATF then spends up to a year trying to figure out how to reject your application. At issue are pistol versions of AR-15s and other types of semi-automatic firearms designed to accommodate a brace, which was originally designed to help our wounded warriors shoot these relatively heavy guns. The ATF, or was that the AFT, has taken various positions on the stabilizing braces, but for the past 4 years they have been utterly legal and have proliferated because they are relatively light, portable, and easy to use. There are literally millions of owners of these devices, all of whom Biden may make felons if this scheme is allowed to continue. Oh yes, and probably not coincidentally, the ones Biden wants to make felons of are overwhelmingly Republican, but never mind that trivial detail. And never mind that according to the Bureau of Justice statistics, these so-called assault weapons are rarely used in crimes. Now, let me explain how this scheme will work. First, under Merrick Garland, the Department of Injustice will issue a proclamation that owners of evil pistol stabilizing braces will have until such and such a date to submit paperwork to the BATF to register them. But the ATF takes almost a year to register each NFA weapon now, so imagine what will happen when they add millions of guns and millions of Title II applications to the mix. Now add in the fine appointment Biden wants to make to head up the ATF. David Chipman, a 25-year ATF agent who, incidentally, is a policy advisor at Gabby Gifford's gun control organization after working for Michael Bloomberg's gun control organization, Everytown for Gun Safety. And a guy whose hatred of gun owners is so pathological that he is making false claims that during the Branch Davidian debacle, truly one of the most egregious government-sanctioned murders of citizens in U.S. history, Chipman is on record as making false claims that the Branch Davidians at Waco shot down helicopters. This is the nutcase Biden intends to have run the ATF. So, imagine if and when Chipman inevitably hamstrings the ATF in processing applications for these evil guns with stabilizing braces, as well as other Title II firearms. Oh wait, your gun isn't properly registered by the deadline? So sorry, turn them all in, Mr. and Mrs. America, just like Dianne Feinstein wanted, but was unable to get for the original 1994 assault weapon ban. For his own part, Biden's Attorney General Merrick Garland, in his presentation, manipulated data by lumping together deaths of differing intentionalities, homicides, suicides, and accidents, to inflate the perception of gun-related homicides. Understand that this is the Merrick Garland that Barack Obama wanted to replace Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court. And the same Merrick Garland who ruled that abuse of the NICS system by the Clinton administration to register guns was in fact not a gun registration system. Who are you going to believe, folks, him or your lying eyes? Calling it an enduring tragedy, Garland claimed that 100 Americans are killed every day, neatly combining suicide, accidents, and homicides, and even justifiable homicides, including by police, to imply that all result from crimes committed with guns. But the biggest lie of the press conference was told by Biden himself when, for example, he claimed, you can walk into a gun show to buy whatever you want with no background check. This, too, is an oft-told lie from gun ban advocates, usually when they claim they want to close the gun show loophole. In truth, of course, exactly the same laws pertain to gun sales at gun shows as anywhere else. What they are usually after when they make the claim are private gun sales, suggesting that Biden's handlers are really after so-called universal background checks, namely processing private transfers, be they sales, inheritances, gifts, or even loans, through the computerized National Instant Background Check System. And the reason they want that is to make sure that they are capturing all transfers for the day when they have enough support to turn NICS into a proper gun registration system. And if anybody claims that NICS can't be used to register guns, tell them it's already been done, specifically by Clinton's Attorney General, Janet Reno, when she refused to expunge NICS transaction records, claiming they were needed for audit purposes. Without doubt, Biden made this claim to support his scheme for adding private sales to NICS under the guise of universal background checks. Equally egregious was Biden's lie that gun makers can't be sued and that Congress gave them immunity from litigation. To give you the history of this, back in the dark days of the 1990s, various left-wing mayors of cities like New Orleans, Atlanta, and Chicago, among others, decided to sue gun makers out of business. These lawsuits weren't based on defects in the products or, for that matter, anything else that gun makers might have done wrong. Instead, they were based solely on what they called novel legal theories, meaning nothing at all beyond a claim that by selling guns they were supposedly marketing to people they shouldn't have them. The idea wasn't that the lawsuits would have merit, it was that the sheer number of lawsuits would overwhelm manufacturers, forcing them to negotiate voluntary gun control that Democrats couldn't pass in Congress. In one case, it worked. We'll discuss that after a short break. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. After a break, we will return with still more critical information enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. As we discussed before the break, among Biden's lies at his recent gun control press conference was a claim that gun makers, quote, can't be sued, and that Congress gave them immunity from litigation. In the 1990s, a number of left-wing mayors sued gun manufacturers not because the gun makers had done anything wrong, but rather in an attempt to overwhelm the industry with costly litigation along the lines of what mass tort firms did to the tobacco industry. The intent was to force gun makers to voluntarily, and I use that word in quotes, adopt gun control that Democrats were unable to pass through Congress. To give you an idea how dangerous this was, in one case it almost worked. Back when Smith & Wesson was owned by a British firm, Tompkins plc, they capitulated to the Clinton administration and promised to, among other things, limit magazine capacity for guns it sold, not sell so-called assault weapons, cut off dealers who sold guns that were traced to crimes, prohibit authorized dealers from selling at gun shows, require training for purchasers, and much more. So, in 2011, Congress passed the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which prohibited lawsuits against gun makers over products that function exactly as intended. Nothing in the law prohibits suing gun makers over defective products. But in his protection against politically motivated suits designed to drive gun makers out of business, that is what Biden says he wants to repeal. So whatever lies you hear, understand that their goal is to make it more difficult and expensive for you to own guns by driving gun makers out of business. Among Biden's other big lies was the claim that the last time we had a ban on so-called assault weapons that it somehow reduced crime. More nonsense. In truth, a 1999 Department of Justice study found no impact on crime, noting further that the weapons banned had rarely been used in crimes before the ban. A 2001 report by the National Institute of Justice similarly found no impact on crime. And an updated report by the same authors in 2004 found that any reduction in crimes using the banned guns was offset by criminals using guns that were not banned, and that rates of lethality remained unchanged. In fact, a few years back I participated in a panel discussion for the ACLU in which, to my surprise, an agent of the BATFE, or should I call them the AFT, made my points for me, noting that not only had crime been unchanged during the ban, but that it increased the workload of the ATF in trying to figure out what guns were or were not banned. And of course, Biden went on to use the usual litany of falsehoods about semi-automatic firearms. Here, understand that the very phrase assault weapon is a deception from gun control organizations to confuse the public into thinking that semi-automatic firearms are assault rifles, which are machine guns. The phrase was coined in the 1980s by Josh Sugarman, then of the National Coalition to Ban Handguns, now the executive director of the Violence Policy Center, when in an internal memo he said, and I quote, "The semi-automatic weapon's menacing looks, coupled with the public's confusion over fully automatic machine guns versus semi-automatic assault weapons, anything that looks like a machine gun is assumed to be a machine gun, can only increase the chance of public support for restrictions on these weapons." You see, according to Biden, there's no reason someone needs a weapon of war with 100 rounds, 100 bullets. Those are his words. In truth, of course, modern weapons of war are fully automatic, firing more than one bullet per depression of the trigger. What Biden wants to ban might look similar by virtue of cosmetic features, but they are by no means weapons of war. Then, of course, he said, and I quote, "Nobody needs that. Nobody needs that." So under Biden's standard, what you live under is no longer a Bill of Rights, but instead a Bill of Needs. And who will decide what you need? Why, Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, and Nancy Pelosi, of course. And on the subject of need, if nobody needs an AR-15, perhaps somebody should tell the Korean shopkeepers who defended their shops against destruction during the LA riots, or the shopkeeper who stood outside his store with an AR-15 to deter looters in the more recent riots. Understand that the goal of Biden and gun control advocates in general is to keep you helpless in order to make you dependent on, and therefore subservient to, government. The upside is that even Biden is unlikely to have the chutzpah to try and ban semi-automatic firearms by executive order, particularly since the Supreme Court will almost certainly strike down a ban done by executive order, unless, of course, he manages to pack the court. The downside is that little can be done about his executive orders except litigation. Now, whether the court will reject Biden's executive orders and the resulting regulatory action, which was done rather than legislation, with respect to 80% lowers and pistol stabilizing braces, remains to be seen. Gun Owners of America has said they will sue, and at an appropriate time, GRNC will likely file an amicus brief in support of any litigation. Without doubt, other organizations will do the same. But as a means of gun rights action, I use legal action last. It's last resort because it is expensive and uncertain. An activist judge can and often does impose his own ideology rather than following the law. Just as bad, a law is constitutional until you prove it isn't. So just like the bump stock ban in its litigation still winding its way through the courts, you would be prohibited from owning anything Biden bans until such time that the ban is ruled unconstitutional in the courts. But if Biden is unwilling to impose a semi-automatic ban through executive action, it all comes down to the U.S. Senate. This administration is now doing all of the radical things we predicted and that they denied they would do. Legislation has been introduced to permanently rig elections on a national scale, essentially legitimizing the fraud in the last presidential election. Legislation has been introduced in the House to pack the Supreme Court with 4 additional leftists who will do whatever the left wants them to do, thereby removing checks and balances to their agenda from the third and co-equal branch of government, the judiciary. Legislation has been introduced to make the District of Columbia a state, all with the cynical intention of ensuring a permanent Democrat majority in the Senate. And leftists continue to sniff around at whether they can end the filibuster, another check against runaway government, by changing the rules to allow a simple majority of 51 votes to pass whatever socialist scheme they come up with. So far, Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has promised scorched earth tactics, including denying Democrats the necessary quorum of 51 votes if they try any of what they are threatening, and, of course, essentially shutting down the Senate. Also acting as a finger in the dike against leftism is West Virginia Blue Dog Democrat Joe Manchin, who has repeatedly and publicly said he will not vote for either ending the filibuster or packing the court. To a lesser extent, Arizona Democrat Kyrsten Sinema has said pretty much the same thing. But I can't even imagine how much pressure the left is putting on these two. Knowing the left, I hope their security is good. According to Politico, McConnell is telling Republicans to say nice things about them, but that's not enough. You need to call them, and I say call because generally web contact forms for congressional representatives are set up only to take input from in-state. You must call them, thank them, and remind them that the future of our republic depends on them doing the right thing. Simultaneously, you must remind Republicans to stand together against the leftist onslaught against the shining republic created by our forefathers. You can do that by going to grnc.org, that's grnc.org, and responding to the alerts that we have placed front and center on the home page. You know, in that press conference, Joe Biden spoke one bit of truth. His one true statement was about getting gun bans passed. He said, "We're not going to give up." Well, that's true. The left never gives up. And if you want to keep this republic, you can't either. Biden said he was going up against the gun lobby. Gun control advocates love to call us the gun lobby as though we were somehow shills for gun makers, the disembodied merchants of death. That's why my friend, the late Neil Knox, former NRA vice president, used to draw standing ovations by greeting gun rights conventions with, "Hello, gun lobby." No matter how hard or expensive or dispiriting this battle becomes, we are relying on you to stop leftism and keep our republic. My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your right to keep and bear arms. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, at HyattGuns.com. I also encourage you to check out my website at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com, spell out the and, where you can find both my writings and earlier editions of this show. See you next week.